Well, good afternoon. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the director of the Dickey Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this event on Saudi Arabia's role in 9/11 and why the US government has kept it hidden. So we are now headed toward the 20th anniversary of the historic events of 9/11. We are reminded of this especially today after the discovery and killing of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the so-called caliph of the Islamic State in Syria over the weekend, someone who had eluded US forces for many years. And of course, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi connects us and is really part of the long shadow of 9/11. The group he led was the successor to al-Qaeda in Iraq, which arose after the 2003 invasion of that country by the United States. Now, as someone who has been deeply involved in counterterrorism since 1998, when Osama bin Laden issued his famous fatwa calling for believers to kill Americans wherever they could find them, and who was working in the White House when we lost 2 embassies in East Africa, and who spent the day in the State Department Operations Center when bin Laden himself was found and killed in 2011, this seems like a chain of events that we will never be fully free of. In the investigations following 9/11 by the Congress, the Blue Ribbon 9/11 Commission, and the federal government, the actions of many, many players were scrutinized. And one of those players that drew the most interest was the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, home of 15 of the 19 9/11 hijackers, as well, of course, as bin Laden himself. Saudi Arabia stood accused of having laid the seedbed for jihadist violence because of its advocacy, its global advocacy for Wahhabi Islam, and the missionary work of its many religious NGOs. Yet all 3 of those inquiries ultimately absolved the Saudi government of direct responsibility for the events of 9/11. Were those findings correct? Well, judging by the size of the audience here, I'm guessing there are plenty of people who are still uncertain, not to say suspicious. Today, we will hear from Jim Kreindler, who is leading a group of attorneys and survivors of victims who are seeking to demonstrate that the government of Saudi Arabia does indeed bear responsibility for 9/11 and must compensate survivors of the victims of that horrible day. And let me say at the outset that if Jim Kreindler says it's so, we need to take the issue very seriously, not only because he is a magna cum laude member of the class of 1977, or the son of a member of the class of 1945, whose name is on the conference center just across the hall from this room. Jim Kreindler is one of the foremost attorneys working in the field of redress for victims of terrorism and in aviation law. And he took the lead role as a member of the plaintiffs' committee in the Pan Am 103 litigation against Libya, which produced a $2.7 billion settlement in additional compensation for the families of Lockerbie. And that is still the only case where any foreign state has ever made such a payment to terrorist victims. That's just one of the many famous cases he's been involved with. Among the others, Egypt Air 990, Swiss Air Flight 111, which crashed in Nova Scotia in 1998, and of course the famous TWA Flight 800 disaster off Long Island. Jim Kreindler received his JD from Columbia University in 1980, where he was a Harlan Fiske Stone Scholar, and he started out his career as an assistant district attorney in Kings County, otherwise known as Brooklyn, in the district attorney's office there. He is the recipient of the 2009 Public Justice Lawyer of the Year Award. He is obviously a very distinguished attorney, but I'm pretty much in awe of Jim also because of his political shrewdness, because he led the effort to enact JASTA, which is the acronym by which the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act law was, which was passed by the Congress. And that law narrows the scope of diplomatic immunities, foreign sovereign immunities, and allows US citizens to sue, if I understand it correctly, foreign states, even if they are not designated as state sponsors of terrorism, which has hitherto not been the case. So this was it unanimous in both houses?
Well, JASTA was passed and then vetoed by President Obama.
And then overridden.
Overridden 98-1 and 346-77.
So those are good numbers if you're on that side. So anyway, clearly he knows what he's doing both in the political arena as well as in the courtroom. And with that, Jim, why don't you tell us your story and your findings?
Thank you, Dan. You know, it's always a great pleasure for me to be back at Dartmouth, and I'm here with my wife, which makes it even more fun. But to talk to you in this room dedicated to my dad about our life's work, Pan Am 103 and 9/11, is especially gratifying. Walking over here, we passed Silsby. When I was here, and I was class of 77, that was, and I think still is, the government building. And like many government majors, I, at the time, had an abiding faith and belief in the integrity and efficacy of our government. Talking to you now, I'll make a prediction. By the time we're done, you will be revolted and horrified to learn what prominent members of our government, including past presidents, have done. You will be equally amazed and thrilled with the courage and determination of a few private citizens and former FBI agents who have beaten the government and defeated the largest lobby effort in the world's history. To begin with 9/11, you know, as Dan said, when all of you came in the room, if asked, well, what did Saudi Arabia have to do with 9/11? The first thing you'd say is 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudi nationals. Some of you who pay particular attention to this might also make the comment that Dan made, and Saudi Arabia has been known to give money to charities who in turn funded Al-Qaeda. But the fact is, 9/11 was an attack on the United States with the active intent and cooperation from 11 known Saudi government officials. Saudi Arabian government officials were the accomplices without whom there never could have been a 9/11 attack. And I'm going to give you a little information about that. The starting place, I guess, is why would Saudi Arabia support Al-Qaeda? Osama bin Laden is Sunni, et cetera. And to understand that, we have to go back to 1979. Most of you with the same hair color as me will remember that year. I was in my third year of law school. The current students obviously will not. But 1979 was a wake-up call to the world and the Islamic world in particular. Two cataclysmic events happened. The Shah of Iran was overthrown, something that seemed unthinkable at the time, by radical Shiite Muslims. And in the same year, the mosque in Mecca was taken over by Wahhabi radicals. Now, the House of Saud was built in partnership with the founder of Wahhabism. But and you must remember that the king of Saudi Arabia, now King Salman, in Arabic, his title is the keeper and protector of the holy mosques. The word king doesn't appear in his Arabic title. When that happened, the royal family had an oh my God moment. If the Shah can be overthrown and Wahhabi radicals can take over the mosque, we are next unless we take dramatic action. And that event prompted the royal family to deliberately start accommodating the Wahhabi mullahs. They did it in two ways. Sometime later, they created a new branch of the Saudi government called the Ministry of Islamic Affairs. The Ministry of Islamic Affairs is dedicated to the spread of Wahhabism internationally. And every embassy and consulate in the world has Ministry of Islamic Affairs officials embedded in it, as well as foreign ministry, intelligence, what have you. The second thing to keep in mind is the nature of the Saudi Arabian government. You all know that there are many members of the royal family. Well, how do you get ahead there? How do you become foreign minister, defense minister, deputy crown prince, or king? They don't have elections. The way in which you rise to prominence and power in Saudi Arabia is to seek and obtain the support of the Wahhabi mullahs. So every prominent person in Saudi Arabia, King Salman, his predecessor, all made their pilgrimages to kiss bin Laden's ring in Kandahar. Without doing that, they would not have the internal support they needed to rise into positions of power. In my mind, it's not so much affinity with Wahhabism that prompts the leaders of Saudi Arabia to support bin Laden, who is not a black sheep by any means. Just as an aside, one of his close relatives on 9/11 is working in the Washington, D.C. embassy as an embassy official and the head of one of the Saudi charities that are supporting al-Qaeda. What did these Saudi officials do? They had supported al-Qaeda not just with money, but with the logistical support al-Qaeda needed to mount the 9/11 attacks and the Cole bombing before it. Those of you who are our age remember the embassy bombings? Okay. Before we get to 9/11, it's worth remembering, something you and I talked about at lunch. Why did bin Laden turn from an ally of the United States fighting the Russians to the vitriolic hatred of the United States? In my mind, the number one reason that caused him to despise us was the presence of U.S. military troops, particularly female troops, in Saudi Arabia after we were protecting Kuwait and the Emirates and Saudi Arabia from Saddam Hussein. So for many years before 9/11, you had Saudi government officials working with al-Qaeda and coordinating with al-Qaeda. What happened on 9/11? The two lead hijackers, Hazmi and Midhar, attended, toward the end of 1999, attended a convention, a conference in Malaysia of al-Qaeda and other terrorists at which the 9/11 attack was planned, as well as the Cole attack. These terror attacks all emanated from a tragic event in 1988. How many of you remember when the USS Vincennes shot down the Iranian Airbus mistakenly, killing 300 plus people? So Iran vowed revenge. The plot to destroy 10 U.S. commercial air carriers was called the Bojinka Plot. a plot that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed knew about and tried to implement. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's nephew, Ramzi Youssef, was the convicted bomber of the 1993 attack on the World Trade Center. 9/11 was a combination of the Bojinka Plot to destroy 10 U.S. aircraft with the attack on the World Trade Center in '93. The World Trade Center, of course, is seen as a symbol of American capitalism, particularly Jewish American capitalism. And that's why it was such a potent target for bin Laden. And our intelligence community knew all this. There's no secret about about the Bojinka Plot and bin Laden's antipathy toward the United States and the support of Saudi government officials. So where did this all begin? The fall of '99, Hazmi and Midhar are in Malaysia planning the 9/11 attack along with other terrorists and the Cole attack. They were monitored by the CIA daily. From Malaysia, after their planning was complete, they went on a holiday that had particular appeal to two radical Wahhabist, soon-to-be suicide murderers who were on their way to heaven in a couple years. So they went on a sex vacation to Bangkok. The CIA monitored them there. From Bangkok, they arrived in Los Angeles January 15th, 2000. CIA monitored their flight and their arrival. Before January 15th, 2000, a high-ranking official in the Saudi embassy, whose name I know, and because of the disgusting protective orders imposed upon us by the Justice Department with the blessing of the court, I can't tell my clients, one of whom is in this room. This official sent an instruction to a Saudi consular official in Los Angeles, Thumairi, ordering him to provide the help that Hazmi and Midhar needed. They didn't speak a word of English. They wouldn't know the exit sign from the entrance sign. So Thumairi and his accomplice, who is a Saudi intelligence official, Bayoumi, arranged with people who were working with them. And this is an interesting thing. Al-Qaeda has had and still has today operatives in the United States. In California, in LA, they needed blue-eyed, blonde-haired surfer dudes who could take Hazmi and Midhar around and teach them how to look and act like Americans. The terrorists were helped by dozens of these people under the control and direction of Saudi government officials. So they were picked up at the airport. They were provided housing near the King Fahd Mosque. That was a center point funded by the then King Fahd. His son came over with $10 million. That was the meeting place for Al-Qaeda. Hazmi and Midhar were given money. Prince Bandar Bush, best friend of George Bush, Saudi ambassador to the United States, his wife, through Bayoumi, gave Hazmi and Midhar $25,000. We have traced the exact money trail from one of the dirty charities under scrutiny into the hands of a Saudi government agent in LA who ran a fake charity who sent the money to Karachi and then ultimately to Mohammed Atta in the Hamburg cell. So the money trail is known. The Saudi government officials, in addition to introducing the two terrorists to other people in the mosque, as I said, started English lessons, gave them money, housing, introduced them to Saudi military pilots who I believe, were instrumental in training them to fly jets. They did a little trip to Las Vegas. I don't know, but I believe that they received training from Saudi military pilots in the deserts around Las Vegas. In a short period of time, the FBI was alerted to the presence of Hazmi and Midhar. Hazmi and Midhar, in fact, roomed with an FBI informant. The FBI did not arrest them, did not question them, lost them. The CIA, of course, what they're doing is illegal, and was probably under the mistaken approach that they could turn the two and that the two terrorists would help root out Saudi dissidents who the royal family would have exterminated. Later I'll talk about that. I'll tell you a little bit about Khashoggi and why he was killed. It's not because he was a dissident, it's because of his contact with us. If I don't get to it, remind me. The two terrorists are in the United States, monitored until they're lost by the FBI and the CIA. And of course, 9/11 happens. Bob Muller became director just, I think, a week or two before 9/11. What happened on 9/11? It was the perfect storm to create the worst and most pervasive cover-up in our nation's history. When President Bush was told about the attack, he was in Sarasota, Florida, reading Horton Does the Who, written by one of our famous alumni, to a kindergarten class when he was told about the attack. The first words out of his mouth was it Saddam? Remember how set he was upon killing Saddam Hussein, who had vowed to kill his father, the previous President Bush. Bandar was maybe his closest friend, been to the ranch in Crawford, Texas, more than anybody else. On 9/11, we were still dependent upon Saudi oil. It's long before fracking. President Bush was set upon using the 9/11 attack as an excuse to go to war with Iraq and kill Saddam Hussein. And who was our most important ally in that war? Saudi Arabia. So immediately, he and those close to him in the White House did not want to hear anything about the Saudi government role in 9/11. On the FBI front, Bob Mueller said, oh my God, look at the mess I've inherited and this colossal failure. This cannot see the light of day. You would expect that the top counterterrorism agents in the FBI would be put in charge of the investigation. One of them is now working with us, and he and I are talking together every day. Bassem Youssef was the first Arabic-speaking FBI agent, the first agent to infiltrate al-Qaeda and turn a high-level al-Qaeda operative. He was the FBI legate in Saudi Arabia and had been with the king and knows the Saudis intimately. Was he put in charge of any of the 9/11 flights in their investigations? He was kept away from 9/11. Flight 77, the flight that crashed into the Pentagon, Hazmi and Midhar were two of the terrorists on that flight. Who was put in charge of investigating Flight 77, where Hazmi and Midhar played the most important role in planning the attack with the assistance of Saudi government officials? Who did Bob Mueller pick to run probably the most important of the four flights investigation? Jackie McGuire was a probationary officer 6 months out of Quantico. If you want to institute a cover-up, You need a young, dumb kid who is going to follow orders. Who was his new head of counterterrorism? Michael McGarity, who came from organized crime, and organized crime is a completely different model than terrorism. Michael McGarity is the principal architect today of lying to the families and keeping the documents that we know exist away from us. In LA, Steve Moore was put in charge of a 400-person FBI team looking at the activities of Hazmi and Midhar and looking at Thumairi, Bayoumi, and the other 9 identified Saudi government officials. Being in LA at 3 a.m. every morning, he would personally call Director Muller. He did it every 48 hours to update him on the investigation. Mueller is reporting to the president for his daily, President Bush, for his daily intelligence briefing. Steve Moore is reporting to Director Mueller on the progress they're making in investigating Saudi government officials. Enormous progress was made by the agents in the field in the first 2 or 3 months, until Bob Muller deputized Michael McGarity and Jackie McGuire to shut them down. Subpoenas that have served would not be followed up. Interviews were canceled. It's over. So when Dan said, why did the 9/11 Commission exonerate Saudi Arabia? Because they were lied to by Robert Mueller under oath in Congress and others who did not want the commission to know what role the Saudi government played, because then Saudi Arabia is our ally in the war against Iraq. And he did not want the world to know about this colossal intelligence and law enforcement failure. The investigation was dead. The agents who are working the case are disgusted, horrified, and after a couple years, when the 9/11 Commission came out, and they know what a lie it is, on their own, they resurrect the investigation. In 2007, they go back to the witnesses and start building the criminal case that every one of them joined the FBI to do, to investigate and prosecute crime, not to be part of lying to America and lying to the families of 3,000 murdered Americans. Their investigation proceeded from 2007 until it was shut down in February, March, and April of 2016. At that point, we had President Obama in the White House and James Comey as director of the FBI. Now, you know, I was a fan until I learned this of President Obama. Joe Biden's a friend. I was his New York chair when he ran for president. My dad and I helped him in 1988 on his campaign. What President Obama did is the most treacherous and outrageous act I know of in our nation's history. President Obama and John Kerry wanted the Iran nuclear deal and the eventual normalization of relations with Iran as their signature foreign policy achievement. And it's a goal we all share. It'd be great if you could get Iran to abandon nuclear weapons and change. What was treasonous is the quid pro quo he entered into with King Salman. The Saudis and the Israelis, Netanyahu, were the strongest opponents to the Iran nuclear deal. Everyone in the room knows there is no shaking Netanyahu in opposing the Iran nuclear deal. But Obama thought he could shake the Saudis and get them to drop their opposition. With their opposition and the Israelis, there's no chance of it passing the Senate. So he cut a deal with King Salman, and his deal was, I will kill the 9/11 litigation if you stand down in opposing the Iran nuclear deal. That deal was struck. As we were mentioning before, when Congress passed JASTA overwhelmingly, Obama vetoed it, the only veto of his presidency that was overridden, and as I said, overridden 98-1, just Harry Reid dissented, and 346-77 in the House. What I thought at the time was that's what Obama did to kill the agent's investigation into 9/11. What I didn't know when JASTA was passed then was what happened in the Bureau. That's when James Comey had Michael McGarity and Jackie McGuire shut down the resurrected FBI investigation. So, you know, being at Dartmouth, the room is filled with smart people, and you're thinking like, how does this guy know any of that? The answer is, after all these years, the agents who have worked the case, many of them have retired, and they've come to us and said, here's what we know. We want to finish what we started when we joined the Bureau. The only way for the truth to come out is for us to join with you. So when we demand documents from the FBI and the Department of Justice, we know exactly what we're looking for. So we have been in a fight, not just with Saudi Arabia, JASTA. Saudi Arabia hired 19 lobby firms, and my estimate is they were paid something between $50 and $100 million a year to lobby against us and kill JASTA. They enlisted veterans and put them up at the Trump Hotel and steak dinners and said, help us get rid of this stupid law, without telling the veterans that they were going to be screwing the 9/11 families, that JASTA was the law the families needed to lift the legal immunity that Saudi Arabia claimed. So we overrode the veto, we beat the Saudi lobbyists, JASTA became law, and we started our lawsuit against Saudi Arabia in 2016, 15 years after we've been engaged in this war. The Saudis were shocked. You know, they've got the king on their side, King Obama. They're spending $50 million. How can a bunch of cripples and widows and orphans hobbling around Congress beat them? So when I said at the beginning, you will be revolted by what our government did, but thrilled with what Americans can accomplish, that is what I'm talking about. Few dozen families saying, we're going to knock on every door and buttonhole senators and congressmen, beat Obama and beat the Saudi lobby. And you know, now I'm waxing patriotic. There's no other country in the world where that could happen. In our battle with Saudi Arabia, not surprisingly, they're lying about the documents and keeping it from us, and they've got a lot of high-priced lawyers, and that's a tough fight. The fight we should not be having is the fight we have on a second front against the FBI and the Department of Justice. Now, we had served FOIA requests, Freedom of Information requests, to get documents we know are in the FBI files on the investigation into Saudi government officials. Here's some of the answers we got to our FOIA requests early on. The documents you seek contain information about Osama bin Laden. We will not give them to you because of his privacy interest in that information. Another one was, we're not giving you any documents unless you produce death certificates for the 19 terrorists. This is our government. This is coming from the Department of Justice. So we have asked for these files. We've been fighting this fight in court for a year and a half. The FBI has given us some documents, 5 tranches or batches. What they give us has redacted information. So I told you the name of the high Saudi official in Washington, D.C. who tasked Thumairy. That was redacted. And what we have, we're given under a protective order that precludes us from telling the families and speaking about it publicly. And I'm disgusted with these protective orders, and we're doing whatever we can to overturn them, but the judge is not terribly sympathetic. So we know, for example, that in early 2016, when the investigation was shut down, remember March, April, the agents wrote a big summary on their findings. It's there. It has this vast body of information about who, what, where, and how the Saudi government officials acted as the essential accomplices to al-Qaeda. We've asked for it. We haven't gotten it. The Senate unanimously passed a resolution, Resolution 610, calling upon the declassification and the release of this information. The FBI has ignored what, how many times do you get the Senate to do anything unanimously now? The FBI has ignored it. The Justice Department has ignored it. I and some of the families were with President Trump on 9/11. The next day, Attorney General Barr invoked state secrets and national security as an excuse to keep the FBI documents hidden. We're fighting that. We have some champions. Tomorrow, Tulsi Gabbard at 1 o'clock will hold a press conference saying release, the information to the families. So luckily, we've got a lot of people, fighting this fight, but we should not have to be fighting our own government. We're making progress in court, but for us to win in court could take another 5 or 10 years. So we're trying to enlist support in Washington for us to get the documents, because if we get the FBI files, the Saudis know the game is up. And probably all of you have been reading about Saudi Arabia's desire to take Aramco public, do the IPO for 5% of the company, a company that will be worth between, depending upon the estimates, $1.3 to $2 trillion, and New York is the preferred venue over Hong Kong or London. So we're operating in Washington to try and get support there, because there's no way that us and the families are going to stand for taking Aramco public 100 yards away from ground zero. So Saudi Arabia has to resolve the 9/11 case for the Aramco IPO in New York to happen, in my opinion. So our fight is on 2 fronts in court, with Saudi Arabia and with the FBI, and daily interaction with people in Washington who can help us and persuade, MBS, who was 15 when 9/11 occurred, to engage and resolve 9/11. Khashoggi. You want to hear about Khashoggi? Okay. So MBS's younger brother, KBS, was ambassador at age 28, Saudi ambassador to the United States. You may remember after Khashoggi was murdered, the NSA released some intercepts with communications from Khashoggi's phone to others. And that contained an intercept of communication between Khashoggi's phone and KBS's phone. Within 24 hours of that information being released by the NSA, KBS, what's the proper verb, did a tweeted the following message: "I've not spoken to Khashoggi. I only texted him, and my last text was October 26, 2017. Something like that's why put the date in? That's weird. So the best investigator in the world, who knows more about Al-Qaeda terror financing than 100 people combined. I said, John, what happened that day? He said, oh, that's the day that one of our investigators met with Khashoggi in D.C. Because Khashoggi was, part of the intelligence community. We knew he knew a lot about Saudi government involvement in 9/11. And he said, would you come to New York and talk to my boss? He said, yeah, I would do that. So I'm sure that as soon as she left, he called KBS and said, look, the 9/11 lawyers are on to me. They know that I know what you guys did. Now, I didn't give him anything, but you're holding my kid in Saudi Arabia? You harm one hair on his head, and I will. So my belief is Khashoggi was killed not because he was a dissident. It's a lot of dissidents, but because he was holding this axe over the Saudis' head. So our fight continues. I could be doing this, for another 10 or 15 years, but I am hopeful that, with the enthusiasm and aid and support by people in Washington, we can kind of break through and bring Saudi Arabia to the table, because I know eventually they're going to lose, and engaging sooner would be better than all these details eventually coming out. So should I stop now and do some questions?
Sure, why don't we
Okay, that sounds good.
And I'll ask a few questions, and then before I'm stampeded, we'll turn it over to the audience. It's a lot for me to wrap my mind around. I'm going to have to completely rewrite my book.
We can co-author the next one.
Yeah. Well, if you give every different version, you can corner the market, right? So let's drill down a bit. From my work, I know that the way that some of these Saudi NGOs worked is that you might have management that was not criminally inclined, but that there were sort of rotten veins, that there were, corrupt lines of communications, and terrorist operations were being supported in different countries by people who were operating without the authorization of the head of these very large NGOs, in some cases. Is it your claim that these Saudi government officials were, in effect, operating in the same sort of way, or is it your claim that responsibility goes very high in the Saudi government?
Yeah, I don't know how high it goes in the Saudi government. I'd say this, given Saudi Arabia, we think of a church-state distinction that doesn't exist there. So, to me, the charities are part of the Saudi government. It's part of the mission of the Ministry of Islamic Affairs. And they all have, profit-making components, whether it's growing poppy, the walnut trade with Turkey's president when he was mayor of Istanbul. King Salman was involved in that, and they cornered the walnut market, and money is being diverted to Al-Qaeda. So I think it was a government role. My real pitch, if MBS is sitting right next to me now, I would say this is the time to engage. Right now, we have taken culpability to 11 Saudi government officials in the United States. It's going to go up the totem pole eventually if we're forced to keep fighting?
So that raises a good question. MBS, I would say, is not in great odor these days because of Khashoggi and Yemen, kidnapping the Lebanese prime minister, the blockade against Qatar, a few other things, small business, all of them. But the one thing that he has done that has earned him a lot of positive reviews in the West is bringing the religious establishment to heel and supposedly putting, modernizers in charge of these enormous organizations, the World Association of Muslim Youth, the International Islamic Relief Organization, so on and so forth. If he can make a compensation without admitting that the royal family, for example, was involved, that these were all unauthorized activities, why hasn't he done that?
I don't think he knows about it and is engaged, but you're right. I mean, he has said there's nothing magical about 1979 and Wahhabism over the last 30 years. So if you were he, I would say in keeping with what you're doing, you have actions taken by Saudi government officials when you were 15 under an old regime. You can demonstrate your commitment to a more inclusive form of Islam by moving past that. And Bassem told me a story. The first day that President Sisi was in office after the Muslim Brotherhood, he went to the home of a woman who had been kidnapped and beaten, by the Muslim Brotherhood, and washed her feet. And in that world, he's not saying, I did it, I'm not responsible for what the Muslim Brotherhood has done, but as the new current head of the country, it's incumbent upon me to demonstrate our desire to move past a painful past. So I think it's a perfect narrative. Our challenge is, you can't get through 150 U.S. lawyers and functionaries to him, in court.
Well, they do have a significant part of Washington, D.C. on their payroll, so there are a number of channels you could use there. I'll give you some names afterwards. So here I'm going to press you. Here's one problem I have with the narrative, and that is the role of Bob Muller. Since I work closely with Bob Muller, and in my view, he's the straightest of straight arrows, and if he saw something as horrible as you're suggesting, I would find it kind of out of character that he would want to hush it up. Now, as we have discussed earlier, there's no question that in Washington there was a sense that the CIA had failed, but the FBI had failed catastrophically, and that there was a danger that the FBI was going to be so demoralized by this failure that it would not recover. But even so, I have to say, I question whether it's Mueller. Isn't there someone further down the line who might have...
Bob Mueller in 2003 testifies in Congress, until the formation of the 9/11 Commission, I had no information that Saudi government officials were involved. Steve Moore has testified under oath, I was briefing Bob Mueller every 48 hours.
So it's one of those things, yeah.
It's one of those things, but look at the circumstances and who was an incentive to continue. I mean, it's like Watergate. You do one bad thing, and then you start trying to keep pushing it under the rug deeper and deeper and lying and lying. And as between Steve Moore and what the agents were doing, I mean, why would Steve Moore and others make up a lie about talking to Mueller? And in fact, we know. I mean, we can trace their movements. Mm-hmm. The 9/11 Commission says, for example, there's no evidence that Thumairy met Hazmi and Midhar directly. We have direct evidence of 6 meetings.
There's a discrepancy there. Yeah.
That's one way to put it.
Yeah. In your view, does one of the things that analysts have picked up on and often criticized is why was the entire bin Laden family quickly hustled out of the country? Is that something that also plays a role in your
Yeah. I mean,
assessment?
I have no doubt that immediately Bandar said, "Oh, look, the public's going to be up in arms. We got to get all these innocent people out of there." But you look at every one of the Saudi government officials who were involved, who we want to depose. They were all either voluntarily or deported to Saudi Arabia. I mean, you take a step back. Here's the largest murder in U.S. history. Anyone, in law enforcement, you have one active shooter. There's going to be 15 witnesses who got them, lunch and a car or whatever. Not a single person has been arrested or indicted. So there was a concerted effort to move the Saudi Arabian officials and other Saudi Arabians who were involved out of the country. And obviously they're not coming back now.
So there is one other conspirator, at least, who's in jail, Moussaoui.
Yeah.
Has he provided any information?
Yeah, so my team went to Supermax and
in
talked
Florence,
to,
Colorado?
talked to Moussaoui, and he had some interesting things to say. Got to think of what's under this hated protective order and what isn't. The one thing I can say is Moussaoui was not the 20th hijacker. We know who, or sure who the 20th is. It's not Moussaoui, it's somebody else.
Okay.
And just as an aside, one flight was a hijacker short. I have no way of knowing this, but I think the reason why the 9/11 attacks occurred that day was the dogs are onto them, and I think they feared that they were going to be unmasked. So I think the attack may have been rushed. I'm going to digress a little bit. The Coles. So Hazmi and Midhar go down to San Diego. The Coles sister ship, the John Paul Jones, was there. We believe they scouted out the John Paul Jones and observed how ships could approach, and that information, when one of them went back and spoke to bin Laden, was given and used for the Cole attack. I also think that their initial reason for going to San Diego was to launch a terror attack on the Ronald Reagan, the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, which was mysteriously moved from San Diego to Norfolk, Virginia that summer. Now, since the CIA had been tracking them, my own guess is CIA to the Defense Department. Ooh, you better move the Ronald Reagan.
So last question, have you had any conversations with any Saudi officials about this?
No.
No.
None.
By choice, or they won't take the meeting?
Well, the way it would work is I could talk to their lawyer who's been paid whatever, $50 million to defend the case and say, why don't we talk settlement, and it's going to go nowhere. I mean, the only way it will happen is from the top, for MBS to say to someone, why don't you explore some possibilities of resolution.
Did we just lose a mic?
Was that me? Okay. Can you hear me okay? Okay, I must have squirmed.
Okay. Questions, please.
Yeah.
Oh, wait, can you just wait for the microphone so that posterity will know your question?
I can't assume that Mueller was acting independently or on his own actions. So what was the connection with Bush?
Yeah.
I assume that Mueller wasn't acting independently and on his own initiative. So what was the connection with the Bush?
My own belief is given President Bush's affinity with Bandar and the Saudis and his desire to go to war with Iraq with the Saudis, he and others made it perfectly clear, we don't want to hear anything about others who were involved, particularly a key ally whose oil we needed. I have no reason to think that President Bush ever talked to Bob Mueller about this directly. My own belief is Mueller had his own interest in the story not coming out, and it perfectly coincided with President Bush, who wanted a close relationship with Saudi Arabia for the war in Iraq.
Let me just ask, do we have any students, first of all? No? Well, in that case. Wait, we have a student.
Hi, I'm Matt.
Hi, Matt.
So if you think that this was mostly Saudi-driven, what do you think this says about the kind of surveillance and suspension of habeas corpus that President Bush activated after 9/11?
I think it's independent. You know, there was a lot of hysteria after 9/11 and a lot of, you know, outrageous bigotry that you saw reflected in officials' actions and legislation. But I don't think that had any cause and effect or any nexus with what the Saudi government officials had done. In fact, you know, you can play the imaginary game of let's go back in time and had it been handled differently. And look, I'm a big believer in being truthful. And I think it could have been a very different world if instead of what happened, said, okay, there's Saudi government officials involved. We're identifying the ones who were involved. The Saudi government is responsible for the actions of its officials. But this is not an indictment of the Islamic world. I think, you know, we'd all be in a way better place.
I'm sorry, just to clarify, I kind of meant I didn't say this, but of Iranian officials and Iranian citizens. Okay. I didn't say that. But.
Yeah, so we have a judgment against Iran for the 9/11 victims, and Iran played a role, a small role compared to Al Qaeda. Here's what Iran did. 8 or 9 of the hijackers transited Iran on the way to the Afghan Al Qaeda training camps. Iranian officials, knowing they were Al Qaeda, and they had special markers in their passports indicating they were Al Qaeda, did not stamp their passports with an Iranian stamp. An Iranian stamp in their passports would have made it impossible for them to get US visas. So, you know, one of the weird things is we tend to think that there's no cooperation, but there was a nexus between Iran and Al Qaeda, Saudi Arabia and Al Qaeda, other terror groups. There were occasions when all their interests would coalesce. So that's what Iran did. And that's why we have huge judgments against Iran. But Iran's role compared to Saudi Arabia's role, you know, is small. So Iran's role was not operational control. It was Revolutionary Guard, Al Qaeda, you know, meetings and sharing information. You know, the weird thing, I've talked about these terror conventions, and it's like, you know, it's like data technology people's conventions or automotive conventions. They all get together and say, oh, you know, what's working? What's a hot idea? Let's, you know, share some ideas.
So actually, I want to follow up on that because you started saying something when you were at the podium, and then I don't think you made the connection. How do we get from the Vincennes to the Bojinka Plot?
Yeah. So after the Vincennes was shot down, Iran vowed revenge. Iran then, and still today, is working through other terror groups, Palestinian General Command, Hamas, etc. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was kind of a freelancer. So in the groups talking about how to wreak revenge, they came up with the idea of, for Iran, we're going to destroy 10 aircraft. And remember the two Air India planes, East and West, who were bombed? I think that was part of the Bojinka Plot. So, you know, here's how they all would cooperate and morph. So, Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine General Command has a cell in Germany. They've built 10 IEDs, improvised explosive devices, to be put in checked luggage to blow up U.S. air carriers. The German police raid the cell in Neuss, Germany, October of 1988, disrupting this plot. That's when the Iranians subcontracted their attack to Gaddafi. Reputedly, Gaddafi was paid $10 million by Iran for having the JSO, it's his intelligence agency, do the Pan Am 103 plot. Symbolically and intentionally, we insisted upon a payment of $10 million per death for each of the 270 murdered people in Pan Am 103. So, you know, the world is filled with coincidences. Captain Macquarie was the captain of Pan Am Flight 103. His son flew the lead F-16 in the Tripoli bombing.
Interesting. Okay, more questions. Right there, you've been very patient.
Hi, my name is Liz.
Hi, Liz.
I have a very basic question about the mental state of King bin Salman, because I was under the impression that right when he became king, he was out to lunch, as you know. So you were talking about Obama and he negotiating, but I didn't even think he was making decisions back then.
The previous king.
King Abdullah.
Abdullah. Okay, thank you. Is Salman capable of making decisions?
I don't know. You know, the stories you read is MBS is the effective head of the Saudi government. Although we saw Salman step in and pull back the IPO a year ago. You know, and there was some supposition that, you know, MBS might be removed as crown prince. That would be great. Well, you know, yeah, yes and no. I mean, the notion of being able, with impunity, to kill someone who threatens your nation is not a notion unique to him in that country or that world. So I don't know. You know, when he removed Prince Nayef was crown prince, and he was deputy crown prince, and he bumped out Nayef and kind of held him.
Mohammed bin Nayef.
Yeah, held him hostage. And there was a real power play among these two branches of the royal family, and MBS seems to have won out.
Have you had any contact with anyone at Guantanamo?
No, we've asked for permission to depose some of them, and that's been granted in theory, and in theory we're going to take those depositions. And I have mixed feelings about those depositions. And frankly, I don't think it's essential for our case, and I don't know that anyone there could or would provide meaningful information on what Saudi government officials did.
I'm looking on this side of the room. Back here.
What would have been the geopolitical objective of the high Saudi officials involved in this plot, in this 9/11 plot? Did they achieve it? And what would be the result of there being some fessing up for having done so?
Yeah. Well, I don't know who the highest officials were. My guess is personal advancement, support from the Wahhabi mullahs for actively assisting bin Laden. And, you know, there's this university, Iman U, and that's where all the imams are trained and the Saudi government officials who populate the Ministry of Islamic Affairs. So you have this ministry directly dedicated to the spread of Wahhabism. I mean, if you'd ask me what would be a great thing for MBS to do, would be to say, I, as a young man, am turning the page on what some people in our government did 20 years ago, because the planning is now more than 20 years ago, and I am disbanding or altering the Ministry of Islamic Affairs. I mean, that's the best way to lend teeth to his statement, I'm, you know, clamping down on the Wahhabi extremists.
Hi, my name is Jim, and we were in Iran a couple of years ago, and what the Iranians say, first of all, they're very pro-American if you talk to people on the street. They're very welcoming to Americans. What they say is, we are surrounded by hostile people, the Saudis, the Israelis. They want to kill us. They're trying to destroy us. And all we want to do is protect ourselves. They say they don't have an air force. So what do you say to that argument?
I don't know. You know, there have been and there are times when the Saudis and the Iranians cooperate. So clearly, each of them is saying, we are the threatened party under attack, and, you know, we're protecting themselves. I mean, that's why, you know, when I talk about President Obama and this deal, I would love to see a denuclearized and Iran open and accessible to the West and at peace. I mean, let me add one other thing. These wars serve a purpose. So the war in Yemen is the way in which MBS has made his wealth in the post-oil, you know, era. I mean, you go back 20 years ago, and you had to, you know, you want a deal, you want, you know, Saudi oil, you have to pay big bribes. Now, any contract, anything the Saudis buy, a percentage, 25%, 30%, has to be paid to a local Saudi company, you know, to help rejuvenate the Saudi economy. Well, guess who owns those local companies? So, you know, if you need to generate, if you need to buy billions and billions of dollars of arms and nuclear power plants from Westinghouse and others, you need a war to justify all those arms or a potential war with a country like Iran. So it relates to your question. I think there's an enormous amount of personal interest at play rather than ideology. But, you know, I'm no expert. I've never been to either country. It's just from, you know, what I'm gathering in a, you know, in a tangential way, you know, with my work.
How about right over here?
Thanks for coming. My name's Luke. So just trying to understand then motivation on the U.S. side. Are you claiming then that President Bush's motivation for invading Iraq was sort of family related because he wanted just revenge for his father and he was completely ignoring any sort of other motivation is purely like you're taking sort of a psychological analysis of President Bush then?
Yes.
Okay, that was the shortest answer of the day.
Thank you.
How about right here while we're, Victor, how about over here? Up.
And remember, after 9/11, you got to do something. You want a war to show we're hitting back. So I think he had his antipathy towards Saddam Hussein, and he needed an enemy, and he needed a target.
So you mentioned, Jim here, you mentioned that Attorney General Barr suppressed release of the FBI report. Have you had any other interactions with the current administration or any smoke signals from them that indicate a change in approach to your litigation?
Here's what I think, yes. I mean, we had a very positive meeting with President Trump on 9/11. I think, Bill Barr is new to this. Here's the point. We've been seeking specific documents, the 2012 FBI summary, 2016, the evidence referred to as to what this high Saudi government official did. Legally, to invoke national security and state secrets, it has to be personally done by the head of the agency. It can only be done by Bill Barr personally. Now, we got an affidavit from Bill Barr and Michael McGarity. Michael McGarity says there's an active investigation, which is a complete lie, and national security, state secrets justify keeping this information from the families. In his affidavit, Bill Barr did not say, I have personally reviewed these documents and I personally have determined that their release would threaten national security and state secrets. So I think, government and bureaucracy, you know better than I think, he had a report from McGarity and others, this is going to jeopardize an active investigation and we need you to sign an affidavit. So he did. And keep in mind what is remarkable and offensive about this. There are many cases where the government has invoked national security and state secrets. Every one of those cases involves CIA activities in another country, intelligence in another country. There has never been a case of domestic murder where national security and state secrets were involved. Now, 9/11 is still a mass murder case in our country to be investigated and the perpetrators and their accomplices prosecuted. And the reason that hasn't happened is the identity of those accomplices and, in my opinion, the intelligence and law enforcement failure from January 15th, 99 through 9/11.
I can talk loud. Why then did they release the name of the third person who
us.
you now believe or have now learned was a Saudi government official? Why did they gave you that, they threw you that bone, but they gave you nothing else. Why did they give you that name?
The families were personally asking for it. So if you're going to handle it on a superficial level, we have said there is a file, we need to see the file, we need to see the evidence. And the most outrageous example is keeping from the families the name and identity of the higher official and what he did. So when you deal at the highest levels of government with the presidency, you get, we're going to help, give him the name. So I am optimistic that we're going to be able to break through. I don't think certainly the president or Bill Barr personally, has any familiarity with all this. And I'm trying to encourage them. Friday will be, the government's papers are due on Friday. We filed a motion to give us this information. So I am hoping that we can get the the challenge is not to convince the highest people, the president, Bill Barr. The challenge in dealing with the administration is to get them to focus sufficiently to overcome what I see as a clear cover-up being perpetrated by McGarity and Maguire. And to state the obvious, when the news is, other than Baghdadi, is impeachment, and everything else, it is enormously hard, to break through. I mean, I get called an optimist because I've been doing this for 19 years and I'm never going to stop. And I am certain we're going to win. It's not that I'm optimistic about winning. It's we're telling the truth and we're right. And eventually, the stars will align so we get the attention of the people with real control who can make it right. And I think it's going to happen, but the challenge I see in Washington is to overcome the power and influence of those who've been perpetrating the cover-up and get the time and attention from those who can do something about it.
If you are granted everything that you're going for, every court, every fight that you're in, that you're granted everything, could you give all of us some idea of the result, the fate of those in Washington and those in Saudi Arabia that would be the result of your having everything?
I don't know. I mean, I think the whole story will come out eventually. And, the Obama-Salman deal is going to change the way history sees President Obama. I think MBS has an opportunity with us to really move Saudi Arabia forward. I mean, if they stop thinking of us as, an enemy to be quashed and defeated by lobbyists, but an opportunity to move past a problem they have that isn't going to go away and only get worse. History could be kind to him. Oh, I keep other things come to mind, which is something you'll be interested in knowing. The mastermind of Khashoggi's murder, Qahtani, is one of the people who was very close to MBS. He is not one of the 11 charged with murder or crimes in Saudi Arabia. Qahtani is the man who tried to kill Jasta. He's on the FARA forms hiring the Washington, D.C. lobbyists to prevent Jasta from becoming law. So, you have this weird scenario where everything coalesces. And, if he wants to get past the Khashoggi murder and 9/11, I mean, here you have the man who was instrumental in one physical murder and an attempted murder of legislation that freed the families to sue Saudi Arabia.
So I have a question for you. Having paid my dues in the government, I am quite sure that pretty much every general counsel and every agency would have been lobbying the White House to preserve sovereign immunities. And I guess the question that I have then is, and I think the president would have been naturally inclined to preserve sovereign immunities and therefore to veto Jasta. What is the evidence that there was some kind of deal with the Saudis in return for which they would not campaign against the Iran nuclear deal? Because as far as I can tell, they campaigned pretty heavily against the Iranian nuclear deal.
Well, they did, and then all of a sudden they stood down for a 6-month period, and then it's passed. So there's two answers. One, I know, but I can't tell you.
I hate that answer.
I know. The second part of the answer is, you know better than I, but there must be, and I'm sure there are, extensive White House memoranda prepared, because he didn't go into that meeting alone, between translators and others. So I am sure that the documentation is there, but has never seen the light of day. And on that score, it's funny. I mean, with all the talk about the dark state, to me, there really is a dark state, but no one is talking about who and what and where it is. Because this is the dark state, not, in my opinion, not all this other stuff.
So we have, I'm not going to call them out, I'm not going to embarrass them, but we have at least 2 or 3 deep staters in the audience. And I know that you have, as a litigator, thick skin, so I invite them to, if they have any critiques, if they want to put them forward. But since I will protect sources and methods, I won't point them out unless they raise their hands. Are you a deep stater? You could have fooled me.
If I may have used my role as a mic passer to ask you a question. Seeing as how you can't really provide the full details of this case or of this process, what do you think the narrative that you are describing how do you think that the narrative that you're describing might impact the perception of American Middle Eastern relations, et cetera, since people are allowed to come to conclusions that are perhaps insubstantiated by true details that you may not be able to communicate or that you might not be sure on?
Well, there's 2 reasons I can't provide all the details. One is time, and the other is these protective orders. So it is the Justice Department, with the blessing of the court, that has ordered us to not reveal any of the material we're given under the protective orders we hate. All I can tell you is what I'm doing or trying to do here in an hour is give you, in kind of a single package, the cliff notes, so you get the main points of what's been happening for 20 years.
Okay. You've been very patient.
Is there anything that we could do to help your efforts?
Oh, I don't think you should have asked that.
Yes. I'm bad at the technology. There is a website, Declassify the FBI 9/11 Files, or something like it. And it's open to the public. It's largely populated by the 9/11 community. But you could get on that. And, the old adage is, sure, talk to your congressman and just say, your senators. I mean, the Senate has already passed this resolution to declassify. But I would say, sure, speak to your congressmen and senators and say, who you are, what you listen to, and what can you do to get the 9/11 FBI files declassified and given to the 9/11 families? It's of concern. And to state the obvious, when it's of concern to a lot of voters, things are going to happen.
Is that a binding resolution or non-binding?
Non-binding. So we want to get a House resolution. So if we have a joint resolution, it's passed to the president, just to get
Send him a message, right?
Right.
Okay.
Eyes on it.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Looking back over the last few years, Trump, when he became president, made his first trip as a head of state to Saudi Arabia. Do you think there was anything in that, or sheer stupidity?
Maybe this is the first time I say no comment. No, I think it was when it happened, I and the clients were, the families were really worried. I think it's turned out to be a good thing for us if he engages, because of the relationship that he and Jared and others have. Clearly he was determined to do something different than previous presidents who would go to, London or whatever. And he obviously reacted very positively to the gold and ceremony and everything else.
The orb.
Yeah, the orb.
Don't forget the orb.
Yeah.
Okay, well, before I ask you to thank our speaker, I just want to tell you that tomorrow, 4:30 in Filene Auditorium, we'll be hosting Gail Smith, the former administrator of USAID and now the head of the One campaign, which is the sort of mega charity NGO that was created by the rock star Bono. She'll be speaking about investment and development in Africa. I very much hope you can join us. And now that I've said that, I hope you will all give a warm thank you to our speaker today.
Well, thank you.